This episode contains mentions of graphic or sensitive material that may be triggering. Listener discretion is advised.
Crime Junkie AF.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the show made by the Crime Junkie, Ashley Flowers, for those who are Crime Junkie AF. I'm so excited because I'm back with a very special guest for you. Many cases that end up in the headlines are also some of the most mysterious ones, leaving unanswered questions like who did it and why did they do it? And when these cases go cold, investigators will often seek assistance from crime assessment specialists and profilers in an effort to fill in those blanks, to answer the why and the who. So, we are bringing in one of the best crime assessment specialists around. He's spent over 20 years with the Pennsylvania State Police, with his last duty assignment as unit supervisor of the Criminal Investigation Assessment Unit. He's also lectured for law enforcement. He is currently lead expert at the Sherry Black Foundation. Should I also mention that he is no stranger to the Crime Junkie verse, exploring cases alongside of me. I'm obviously talking about Patrick Zip Zirpoli. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here.
This isn't our first rodeo.
It is not. We've had many rodeos.
Many rodeos
before.
We were just talking. My brother was in the studio a second ago. I met you back when I was a baby podcaster.
Yes, you were the little girl with the backpack. That's exactly what you were to me. And it's funny. That's how I still see you. I still see you sitting in the back of the room when we were at Purdue teaching, and that's the first time I met you. And you were just brand new to this scene, and you were just starting up. So.
Yeah, I weaseled my way into a law enforcement crime assessment training.
You did, and you made Richard Walter mad, to be honest with you, because he's like, what's that little girl doing in this room?
Why is she here?
Yeah, why is she here? These are secrets. We can't let her know.
I went to 2 of those trainings. And then you and you've been wonderful and helped us kind of work on a number of cases. So if people have listened to our shows, you did an assessment on the Pelly case for Counterclock.
Yes.
We worked on Darlene Hulse together for
yes.
Deck Investigates. So, I mean, we've done this once or twice.
We have. And you know what? I like this collaboration with you because it just kind of brings in a whole different world for me. Like, I came to see you live in Philly, which was like, these crime junkies.
They're for real.
They are for real. Like, I was sitting there with my wife, I was like, oh my gosh, look at these people here. And you know, you and we did a live show last year on the Sherry Black case.
Yeah.
We did the Sherry Black case, again, as a podcast. And I think we have a great relationship. And like I said, you're still that little girl to me that I met however many years ago. But you're still true to that. Yeah. And I think that's a big thing for me.
Thanks.
Thanks. And true to your passion, I guess.
And do you want to talk about so you're with or not exclusively, but you work a lot with the Sherry Black Foundation right now.
I do, yes.
And you mentioned the Sherry Black case was one that we covered. We did an episode on the Deck about it. We did kind of a live show together. What's your work with the Sherry Black Foundation? What does the foundation set out to do?
Well, and I'll go back to the case itself. First off, Sherry Black is the mother of Heidi Miller. The Millers are the wealthiest family in Utah. And, you know, when you live in the ivory tower, all of a sudden horrific, horrible things happen to them. And Heidi's mother was brutally murdered, and you know that. So even before the case was solved, I had the opportunity to work on the case for years, but they created this foundation to teach law enforcement and to work on other cases. Like, we do a lot of consultation on other cases. So they pay me to just go and help other law enforcement. And that's kind of the crux of all what we're doing, plus the training side of it also.
Which I love because I think one of the things, if I recall correctly, is this happened in an area where they didn't see that kind of crime. You said it was brutal, and that's an understatement. And instead of just being angry, I think it's very inspiring to see a family who said, okay, let's not be angry that these small departments don't know what they're doing. Let's try and go teach them. And so it's kind of been my understanding that the mission has been to go, let's go take this training to the people who may never see this case. And I think that's something you said in the training. You may never see this in your whole career, but the one time you do,
you'll know what you're looking at. I actually said that when we started. I just finished teaching 3 days at Purdue. for law enforcement. And that's my very first comment. I'm going to show you things that, again, you may never see before. They're horrific. They're horrible. But when you see it at 2 o'clock in the morning, you've already seen it before and you understand what you're looking at. And I think that's the big purpose of all of that. And I tell everybody it's not a PG show. And you know that. You sat through it. It's a rated R show, if not worse than that.
Oh, my.
So, but again, it's getting them to understand, the evil lives where we live. And people, and some of these big cases that we've seen through the years, people don't want to wrap their head around that. And people don't want to understand, hey, evil lives down the street from me. And that's what we try to get people to understand and try to really open their minds to that. And it's not always the wandering psychopath. And that's what we want it to be. But it's never, when it really comes down to brass tacks, like the offender in the Sherry Black case was 19 years old when he committed the crime. And I said that in 2012, that he was a young kid. And he ended up being 19 when he committed the crime. So, we have to understand that. We have to understand and kind of, it's interesting because you want to understand the mannerisms and the behavior of the offender from the evidence at the scene. So that's what we kind of really push to people. So,
and the other thing that you always say too is like, because it's a lot to take in. I've taken the class twice, and if I took it a third time, I would probably still pick up something that I didn't get the first time before. But like, you want people to know who to call, because you're like, I'd rather be there day one than 20 years later looking at pictures.
Yes. Pick up the phone and call me. I tell everybody that all the time. Send me an email, give me a call. It doesn't matter. Like, we want to help you solve it now versus come in. Yeah, and I've been asked, hey, will you call these people and go help them with their case? And we don't do that. You call me, I'll come if it's your case, but I'm not going to call you and say, hey, can I come work on your case? And some of those things, if you call within those first week or first 2 weeks and we get involved, we can move it down the road a lot quicker. And so it doesn't go unsolved.
Give me a little history on Patrick Zirpoli. Like, how did you? How did you? You've always known this is what you wanted to do. Did you wake up like as a kid and were you playing cops and robbers or like what?
It's funny because I graduated high school, went in the military, went in the Marine Corps, and came out, and I actually applied to the New Jersey State Police because I lived in New Jersey at the time. And, Pennsylvania State Police and Pennsylvania Department of Corrections all at the same time. So Pennsylvania Department of Corrections called first. So I'm like, I need a job. I'm going to go work for them. I'll take it. I'm in. So I worked for them for a minute, like two years, give or take.
Was it just like natural coming out of the Marines, like that you stay in law enforcement?
Yes. My father was a local police officer in New Jersey, and he got hurt on the job and he retired in the mid-'70s. But it was always an interest to me, I think it's all about public service. Like I've been a public servant since I've been 18 years old. So between the military, Department of Corrections, the state police, and even what I do now, and I think that's a big piece of it. Like in what I do now, I just kind of fell into this. Like this wasn't, I want to be an expert in crime assessment and sexual sadism and all of these other crazy things.
You weren't dreaming of that as a kid?
No, I wasn't dreaming. I don't think anybody does. But
they end up in a different path.
Yeah, they do. They end up doing life somewhere. Yeah. They're in life in prison somewhere. So, but and I kind of just fell into that. I fell into that, when I got into state police, everyone starts in uniform. And then, the crime side of it really started that was where my interest lied. So I
How did you realize that?
On that?
Or did you get involved with a particular case or?
Well, at the beginning of my career, when I first went in the crime unit, in the criminal investigation unit, I worked a lot of child abuse cases. So I'm an expert in child abuse and investigating child abuse. And after we had the whole scandal with Penn State in Pennsylvania, I helped rewrite all of the laws on child abuse. And that really, being able to do that and just helping the most innocent was really a big thing to me. And then it just kind of developed from there, when I got into the criminal investigation assessment unit and then became the supervisor of the unit. So I just kind of grew. And I had that opportunity to meet Richard Walter and meet Bob Keppel and, Bob Ressler and really learn from them and become who I am. So
So you didn't invent crime assessment. It's been a thing.
It's a thing. It's been a thing for a long time. It's been a thing since probably, I always tell everybody, one of the very first people they did an assessment on was Hitler back in the 30s and the 40s. Like they assigned a whole unit to do an assessment on him, a psychological profile on him, and that's where it really started. And then it comes up through the 50s. You know, they used it on the Boston Strangler, Metzke, who was doing the bombings in New York. They used crime assessment and criminal profiling on him. And then the FBI kind of picked it up in the 70s with the serial killers, with Bundy and people like that.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah.
So what's the, because you tell me there is a difference between crime assessment and profiling. I feel like everyone knows profiling. I mean, it's literally mainstream TV, but there is a difference, right?
It is. The big difference between the two is profiling is psychological and crime assessment is evidence-based. So what we do is we look at the evidence at the scene. And I tell people this all the time. Like, you know, when we break it down into different categories, but everyone has mannerisms about themselves. Everyone has behavior that kind of grows with them and develops with them through life. And those behaviors come out when they commit a crime. And that's what we look for in the evidence, what's there, what's not there. You know, why is something like this? In a lot of cases is, why is that person the victim? Like, why did they choose this person versus somebody else to do this to? So, and it's really evidence-based that we go off of what we see at the crime scene or don't see. And it's not psychological. Like, if you look at some of the older profiling, like they're given, you know, hey, we think this is a white male, and given an age and some of these other things. We don't go down there. Like I always say, and you know this, I can get you into the right church. I can get you into the right pew. It's your job to figure out which one of those 5 people did this. And that's what it comes down to.
So why don't you, if you will, give the Crime Junkies maybe a crash course?
Crash course here, Crime Junkies University. That's what we're going to have here.
Yes, so, Crime Assessment 101.
Crime Assessment 101.
I think what I sat through twice was like a multi-day seminar. We've got 1 to 2 hours.
And
teach us everything we need to know.
I'm going to solve crime tomorrow. I'll start. And like I always tell everybody, Richard Walter, Bob Keppel, those guys are really big about the titles of these different things, the titles of the subtypes. I'm not. I'm very big about understanding that there's differences between these individuals. So when we start looking at crime and looking at how to break things down, we start with organized and disorganized. The FBI calls it planned and unplanned now, but still the same thing. You know, is the crime scene organized? Does it seem that this person had a plan when they came there to commit this crime and they're able to carry that plan out? Or is it disorganized where it's just kind of knee-jerk reaction, opportunistic type thing?
I was going to say, is that the difference between premeditated and not premeditated?
Yes,
okay.
And that's exactly what it comes down to. Is the crime planned or is it unplanned? Do I just knock on your door and you end up being that right person at the right time I'm going to do this to? I've been thinking about it for a long time, but now all of a sudden I knock on Ashley Flowers' door and I'm like, oh yeah, and I'm going to commit that crime. So that's the difference, and you can see it, and it plays out in the evidence at the crime scene. You know? Because if it's organized, if I'm organized, I'm going to bring a weapon with me. I'm going to make sure I have everything I need with me to commit that crime. I'm not going to hope that you have duct tape. I'm not going to hope that you have a knife that I can use. So we start looking at those things. You know, does the offender bring things with him and leave with those things, or does he get them from the scene and leave them at the scene? They're too big. And again, it's the difference between planning it and not being planned. So we start breaking it down like that. And like I always tell everybody, we kind of silo things. We start, and it's weighted. The difference, the problem is, for years people have always said to me, hey, create me a checklist. Create me a checklist so I can now just check these things off and I can figure out what it is at the end of the day. But the problem is this is a thinking man's game. Like it has to be weighted. You'll have aspects of the crime scene that may be organized, but other things are disorganized. Which is the overwhelming one? Is it organized or disorganized? So, and it really, like I always tell people, it's a thinking man's game. It's not, you can just check off boxes and say, this is what this is. So
interesting. How does you had said that the person or who they choose can also tell you something about them. So like, how do you view victimology?
Well, I mean, victimology is probably one of the most important things to do. We look at two different things: victimology, and then the suspect themselves, what it takes to commit the crime. Is it high risk or low risk for him to commit the crime? But we always take a step back and say, why is that person the victim? When I ran Amber Alert in Pennsylvania, I always stepped back and looked at that. Why is it the 5-year-old, not the 12-year-old, if they're both at the same location at the same time? So we always look at victimology as far as how does that person become a victim? And you kind of break them down into low-risk victim, moderate, and then a high-risk victim. And, do they have behaviors themselves that put them at risk of being a victim of a crime? So we really try to look at that as far as the victimology. And a lot of cases that we look at and we get involved in, the Sherry Black case, the Delphi case, the Kohlberger, they're all low-risk victims. You wouldn't expect them to become the victims of those violent crimes, but they do. So it speaks volumes about then the offender and that high risk that the offender has to take to commit the crime.
So there are, within the crime assessment, there are 4 types of offenders.
4 subtypes, yes,
Subtypes.
of offenders, yes.
Wait, what's the difference between a type and a subtype?
Nothing.
Cool. I just got the word wrong.
You just got the word wrong. But
what are the 4 subtypes?
We can look at this I always tell people, just when I was teaching at Purdue, I told them the same thing. Behavior and all these subtypes apply to every crime. It just doesn't apply to violent crime. It applies to theft. It applies to everything we see. And it just applies to just human nature. Like, criminal behavior mimics normal human behavior. The only difference is it's criminal. That's it. Like, if you're an organized person, like I was just in your office, you're an ultra organized person. If I go into your office and there's stuff all over the place and it's a mess and you're a disorganized person, if you commit a crime, it's going to be the same thing. So that mannerism is going to come out in when you commit a crime. So when we look at the subtypes themselves, it's really power subtypes and anger subtypes, whichever the crime, and you can have spikes into anger, but the first one is power assertive, meaning that normal guy, want to have control, and we all know people like that, want to be in control all the time, macho, kind of acts like that. And that mannerism and that individuality will come out in the crime scene and come out in the victim selection, come out in all of that. So then we have the power reassurance, which is kind of a fantasy-driven individual. So I'm going to fantasize about doing things, and this is where like our child abusers sit. This is where our child abductors sit in this fantasy side of things, where I'm going to fantasize about doing this, and when I actually come into reality to commit the crime, it's never the same. Like, it's great in my head, but now in real life, it kind of falls apart. And then it spikes into that homicide or that violent crime piece.
Why is it called power reassurance?
Because they want to be that power assertive guy, but they have to do it through fantasy. That's why it's reassurance. That's why they call it power reassurance.
Okay.
So that's the difference between the two. They kind of sit in the same thing, but one is just and again, this is where like our people who commit domestic violence, things like that, sit in that power side of it. But the other guy, it's more fantasy driven. Like, you'll see, post-mortem mutilation. You'll see, post-mortem sexual acts happen with those power reassurance person, because, hey, you're cool. I fantasize about doing X, Y, and Z with you, but once I'm in face-to-face with you, you're kind of scary.
Yeah.
So I'm going to wait until after you're deceased. And then even with child abusers, like, a lot of the times you're not going to have them actually like have sexual intercourse with a child. You're going to have them abuse them and then masturbate later, fantasizing about what they did. So, so it's kind of that difference between that. And the big thing, and like I'm very big about, you have to understand it, because when you interview these people and you talk to these people, you can't come in there and be appalled by anything they say. Like, I'm good with everything. I really am, because of that. Because I want to make sure if I go in an interview room with somebody,
Can't look shocked.
I'm good. You know what I mean? And usually when I get in conversations with offenders like this, I always lead that conversation because I understand it. So I can explain to them why they did it. I can explain to them what they did, and this is the reason why you did it. So,
how are you actually good after the conversation? Is it like a lot of Jack Daniels or like
a lot of good Irish whiskey? That's what it is. It's funny because like I've gotten very good at like separating myself from it. I got very good about putting my emotions to the side and being able to focus on that task at hand. And like for me, it goes back to that public service. I want to, if I can get that person off the street now before he commits 20 other crimes, that's what my goal is, and I want to get them as soon as possible and get them locked up. So that's always my goal. And for me, and I always tell everybody, and I just said this when I was teaching, that confession is the golden nugget. Mm-hmm. Having them confess to you what they did is the golden nugget of all of it, So I think that to me is another big piece of it, that I want people to tell me what they did.
It's what I say about like even doing this. People ask, this is on a far smaller scale, but like how do you talk about true crime all day, every day? And I say that I couldn't do it if I didn't feel like I was making the world a better place because of it. But it still like gets to you, doesn't it? Like how have you done this for this long and not been like, oh, the world's a place I should give up on?
Yeah, that's why I want to move to Italy. So, that was our conversation last week. Yeah, so I don't know. I guess I just set it aside. I understand how evil people are, but I look at it from the victim side of it. I look at the victim's family side of it. I want to, like with the Millers, and them, nicest people in the world. Mm-hmm. They really are, and this tragedy came to them, and I said to them the very first time I met them, I'm not here for you. I'm here for Sherry Black, mm-hmm. and I don't care who you are, because it's all about them. It's all about the victims, and it's all about doing right by the victims. And we know that in society, when we're dumping almost 8,000-9,000 unsolved cases into that huge number every year, every victim deserves something. Every victim deserves to have their case looked at. And, it's funny, like I just was teaching and, day 2, the analysts from the Indiana State Police are like, oh, here's a case for you. Can you look at this for us? And I don't have a problem with that. I probably have 10 cases sitting at home that I have to get to when I get home, but it's hoping that I can just move it a little bit further down the road, and then be able to, and I do. I really have trained myself and learned to kind of just all set it aside. I've seen horror, I've seen horrible, horrible things, and you just learn to just put it to the side and you don't dwell on it. So
some people are built for it.
Yeah. You're wired for it.
Yeah.
You're wired to be able to do this. I always talk about, like, even, when we taught sexual sadism at the American Academy of Forensic Science, and I said the same thing there. Like, if you get in a room, you have to be wired to be able to talk to one of those guys. You have to be wired the right way to be able to talk to a Ted Bundy or BTK or some of those other people, because if you're not, you're done. They're going to go up one side of you and down the other. So,
speaking of BTK, have you seen he's in the news these days?
No.
Oh, dude, we've got something to talk about in a minute because he's like back in the headlines big time.
Oh, really?
They could probably use your help. I actually have a question. So, talking about power reassurance, you talk about that being the fantasy person. We talked about victimology. Something I see, like a misconception all the time, is that people think a perpetrator will have a specific type of victim, just children, just elderly women, just young women. But I've also seen a lot of cases where it can be across the board. It's just someone that they can overpower. Is that a power reassurance? Like someone who's just going to target the elderly or young people because they know they can't take someone their own age?
Yes, they're vulnerable to them. And I always tell people, unless they're diagnosed as a pedophile, like true pedophilia, I'm only sexually attracted to 12-year-old girls. They will just go after someone vulnerable. They'll go after someone that they can overpower and control. Like, we've had people before who will victimize children, but also victimize someone who's has diagnosed with some mental health issues or is 80 years old. So it's all across the board. as long as they can overpower that person. They're not going to go after someone their own age. They're not going to go after someone who might beat them up. They're going to go look for that vulnerable person.
And that's your power reassurance, or can it fit in multiple?
Well, it can fit in multiple.
Okay.
It really can. But really, with power reassurance, that's their focus.
Okay.
Their focus is because they're not that power type person that they want to, and everything's done through that fantasy script, that they want to make sure they can overpower that person. Like we've had, and I've seen in the news before, individuals who have abducted and murdered children have also attempted that on older women and didn't complete it because they ended up beating them up. Then they're like, oh no, I got to go back to this over here. So and they learn. All criminals learn through that life of their crimes, that they learn from crime to crime to crime how to better commit things and how to better do things. So,
all right. So we have power assertive, power reassurance. What's the next one?
We get into the anger continuum. We get into...
So power and anger is the reasons everyone kills?
Yes. Power and anger are the reasons all crimes are committed. Think about that. If I'm going to come to your house and steal your stuff, I'm going to take control and have power over you by stealing your stuff. So when we look at this, really, these power and anger, you can almost put every crime that we see into one of these two categories. When you really take a step back and look at it. And I've done that before when I first was introduced to this, and like I thought it was silliness and nonsense, to be honest with you. It's the truth. I listened to Richard Walter, and I'm like, that dude is crazy. Like, I don't know what he's talking about. But then when I took a step back and really looked at it, it's really common sense. Like I tell people, like it goes back to that whole Sherlock Holmes thing. Like, if I tell you how I got to this answer or my conclusions, once I tell you, you're going to be like, oh, that wasn't really that hard. That's why I don't tell people how I got to this. I just say this is what it is. So, but it is power and anger. So the next ones are anger. The next ones are anger retaliatory and we see a lot of spikes into that. Like, anger is an emotion. And what happens is when crimes are committed and we call it the paralogical reasoning that we all have. Like we all have cognition and emotion are intertwined, and that is how you kind of function every day. When emotion takes over, actually your IQ comes down. When you think about it. And think about this.
No, it's so true.
It is true. Like have you ever said something stupid to the person that you loved when you were mad?
Absolutely.
And it's because emotion took over.
Yeah.
And I tell people that all the time, and we have that same thing. And when crime is committed, that emotion will take over. And that's where anger is. And you'll do things that you never, these anger retaliatory people, will stab someone 100 times, will do horrible things. And, the crime isn't finished until the anger is sated. So what'll happen is you'll have all of these post-mortem injuries because they're still mad. We had someone who shot his wife and he was still mad, so he takes her in the basement and beheads her and quarters her. Ooh. So that's anger. We had an Amish gentleman who stomped his wife to death and was still mad, so he went and got a butcher knife and eviscerated her, cut her stomach open and pulled all of her organs out. So that's anger, and that's what we talk about, and that's what you see. And that's why it's so important to train these people, because when you go to one of those scenes, you don't want your own emotions to take over. You want to be able to set all of that aside and look at that case and say, look, same thing happened in Sherry Black. Horrible, horrible crime scene, stabbed multiple times, post-mortem activity happened, and that just overwhelmed everyone. And that's why it goes unsolved for so long. So that's why for us it's so important to teach people about this and have them understand. And again, evil lives down the road. Evil lives next door. We don't want evil to live in our neighborhood with us, but there's individuals out there who'll do this.
They got to live in someone's neighborhood.
They got to live in someone's neighborhood, so they got to be there. And it's interesting when I can come in and look at a case. I can even look at a case from afar not even being involved in it or really looking at the case and say, I know where that guy's from, just by looking at the details that may be in the news or looking at the details that someone may tell me about the case, and because people, if you're looking in the wrong direction, you're never going to find the person that you're looking for. So like I said, these anger things, and we've all seen crimes like that. We've all seen where we have these anger crimes where I'm mad and I'm going to come and I'm going to stab you 100 times or stab you 50 times, and it's overwhelming. It is to see it. But you have to be able to, again, step back, calm down, and look at it right.
So that's anger retaliatory.
Yes.
What's the last one?
Last one is the top of the mountain we're here now is sexual sadism, anger excitation. So they are your Bundys, your Gacy's, individual BTK, things of that nature. That's where those guys sit. And it's all about dependence, dread, and degradation. It's all about, these are guys who will come take you and keep you for 30 days and do horrible, horrible things to you just for their own amusement and pleasure. These are guys who will strangle you just to give you CPR so they can strangle you again. That's these types of individuals, and there are sexual sadists. And it's funny because there's like Richard Walter put together like a helix or a continuum that these guys follow this path. And kind of the top of that mountain and the ceiling of it all is cannibalism and necrophilia. So when we see some of these individuals, like we'll use BTK as an example, he didn't kill for 20 years or X amount of years. But what he did is he practiced autoerotic sex where he would dress himself up like his victims and take pictures of himself. And he was able to fantasize about what he had done before because he was a sadist. And sadist sits here, necrophilia is right above it, cannibalism's above that. He wouldn't go to necrophilia. He was fine where he was at, so he wouldn't take that next step. But some of them we see out there will take that next step. You have the Dahmers who will get into cannibalism, and they'll take that next step. But they've come through all of them to get there.
But it's anger that's driving them, though.
It is anger. Anger at women, want to have control over women and men anymore. Before it was just because of how society is. If we go back to the 70s and go back to the 80s, it was all like, men would do this and women are always the victims. But now it can be anybody. Yeah. We have a lot of people who, will target young men and target, young females. It doesn't matter anymore with these sadists. So, and the problem is the internet. Not that it's not a good thing, but it normalizes this behavior. And we have to think about that. Like, if you think about 30 years ago, if I did this, if I dressed up like a raccoon every Thursday night to have sex, I would think that was weird. But if I go on the internet today, we can read all about that. We can see all these clubs and all the furriers who go to Las Vegas and all of these other things, and that normalizes that behavior. So that becomes some of these issues. If you look, there's BDSM websites. They've made movies about it. So it's really normalized that behavior. But, a sadist is someone who's going to do that for pleasure. And I always say, I was talking with a lady a couple of years ago, and she said that she has a friend who practices BDSM, and like she interviews him and she thinks she's an expert in sadism. And I'm like, well, that's all consensual. The sadist is going to come knock on your door, drag you to his house and tie you up in the basement for 30 days. That's the difference between the two. Yeah. And do horrible, horrific things to you.
But so with the other one, with anger retaliatory, you talk about the anger spiking. And so it takes over, controls their cognitive thinking. It seems like this anger excitation, they're very in control of themselves.
100%. Super planned, super organized are going to.
So you're never going to see a disorganized anger excitation. No. When
you think about them, like, we have Bundy who's abducting multiple women off the same college campus in the same day. If anybody's ever seen his vehicle when it was at the museum in Washington, D.C., I think it's in Kentucky now somewhere, he had the front passenger seat out of it and he had an eye bolt up through the floor. So he can abduct someone, tie them to the floor, and then take them away. So super planned, super organized, will come and do these horrible things. And if they come to your house, they're going to take everything with them. They're going to wash your body, make sure there's no evidence, and then move on to the next one. So, and that's why they go it goes unsolved for so long. Look at the Golden State Killer. I mean, that's where he sat, and it took how many years to finally catch him. And even like with BTK, it took us so long to catch him. Bundy was the same way. They're so organized and so planned at what they do that it's so hard to identify and catch them.
Do those people normally, or do you find that they blend into society more? Than the others?
They do. They're normal. You look at them and look at this. Bundy had multiple degrees. John Wayne Gacy has pictures taken. I think it was with President Nixon's wife because he was big in the Democratic Party. So a lot of them just blend in, and you don't even think about that. And all BTK worked for the government out there doing something. Just kind of blended in society, but had this other life that they were living.
Wild.
And they're married. A lot of them are married. If you look at the bike path killer up in Buffalo, New York, married for 20 some odd years, happy marriage, wife didn't know anything about it, and all of a sudden he's out raping, murdering women.
Do they always not know anything about it? Because I feel like there are a lot of times though where you when you start peeling back the onion, they're not very nice husbands or fathers or.
Yeah, no, and I think they always, you always get it to they have an inkling. I think something's wrong, and we all know that. Like you work with a bunch of people every day. Yeah. So if something's going on with somebody, their behavior changes, their attitude changes, and I think you'll get that. You'll get them saying, "Oh, I thought something was wrong, but really couldn't put my finger on it." And like you said, when you start peeling back that onion, then all of a sudden, and I always tell people, like I do a lot of, and did when I was at the state police, work with Department of Corrections and people who work with Department of Corrections doing bad things with inmates they shouldn't have been doing. But every time that comes to light, all of a sudden you start interviewing people and they're like, oh, I could see that, and when they take a step back and they think about it, they're like, oh, we saw this, and this, which probably led up to that happening. And we saw that behavior change. So a lot of people can see that in people. They see that behavior change, especially your significant other, and even with you, your husband sees your behavior, knows when you're mad, knows when you're sad, knows when you're happy. And
yeah, it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, because again, it's that change of behavior that you have.
Yeah.
So
let's talk about some of the cases that are in the headlines now. I want you to give me your assessment on that. And this first one we've already talked about, but Idaho.
Okay.
Brian Kohlberger. So we know who he is now.
Yes.
But one of the questions, there has been this why for so long. He goes into this house where seemingly he knows no one. He kills 4 kids. And then the strangest part to so many people is that he walks out of that house, passes one of the other kids that lives there, and does nothing to them. Who is he?
When we start looking at the subtypes and we start trying to place him in, and you can even hear it because during the interview with that last girl who heard conversation that he was having with the last victim, oh, I'm here to help you, I'm going to take care of things. He's a fantasy-driven guy, and his fantasy was for that one girl. And I'm going to tell you right now, you probably wouldn't have had 4 victims if he got to her first. You would just have 1 victim, okay? And I think the whole thing is, as he's there and as he's going through that house, he spikes into anger, and he spikes into that.
So he started as power reassurance?
Yes, yeah, he is. And it spikes into that anger level of it and ends up killing 3 people before he gets to the person. And it could have just been an interaction. He could have seen that girl one time and she said hello to him, and that was all it took. Because they're so fantasy driven. That's like you. Like if you
What? Whoa.
Wait. Stop.
That's not like me.
No. I'm saying like this. But if you say hello to somebody and everyone knows who you are, and people, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, Ashley Flowers said hello to me. I know I'm going to build this fantasy about she wants to be with me just because she was nice to me. And that's how fantasy-driven these people are. Like, oh, this girl said something nice to me. She wants to be with me. And then he goes and wants to live that out. That's why he's having this conversation with her at the end. But just happens, the other 3 are just byproducts to get to her. And you can see that. But then when we talked before about the anger, once the anger's over with, he sates, he's done. That's why he walks past the last person. Like, why? When I heard that you left a live witness, I'm like, That's the only explanation there could be, is that he spiked into that anger, and then once that anger sates, he's good, and he walks out the door and doesn't do anything to her because you're leaving a fifth person alive at the scene.
Is this where you might also see, you talked about seeing organized and disorganized together. Is this where you might see that, where he came in organized, came in to do this fantasy, but when he spikes into anger, he's all out of sorts?
Yes, and that's what happens here. That's why he leaves the knife sheath. That's why things like that happen, because he spikes into that, and when things go out of control, I don't think he planned to have to interact with all of these other people. And when he did, it became a disorganized scene and became kind of all over.
Because he didn't plan for it, yeah.
He didn't plan for that to happen. I planned to be able to go there and get this girl, and that was going to be my thing. So, and it's interesting. Like and for me, the why is always the big thing. The why, the crime, because, and I tell everybody, when you look at an investigation, the why can get you the confession. The why can get, if you understand what happened and why it happened, and you're in that room with that person, you can then explain to them, I understand why you did this, and this is why you did it. So let's just talk about the details of it. So it's super important, because if you don't have the right why, you're going to go in the wrong direction all the time. So,
what about another big one that have been in the headlines, and I know you are familiar with this one, is Delphi.
Oh, I know that case.
You know that case
I know
a little
that
bit.
case.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a little bit. So, very interesting case. And I'll tell you, kind of without, I think I signed my firstborn away just to look at the case, because I signed the biggest confidentiality agreement I ever had in my life to look at that case when it was still open. But
well, and I'll say, like, what's been known in the public is that two young girls in Indiana, they go for, we had a makeup snow day or something. It's like February. It's beautiful outside. They go for a hike in Carroll County, Indiana, middle of nowhere. There's Snapchat pictures of them on this bridge, and they go missing. They're found somewhere in that area, deceased later on. And there's actually cell phone picture, video, audio that one of the girls took in the moments before their death. All that has been released to date was this grainy picture of a man walking on a bridge. You can see, his outline. You can't really see his face. He's got a hat. He's got a coat. And then what police released of however much video they have was just a tiny clip of the perpetrator telling them to go down the hill. And for 5 years, it went unsolved. And now, recently, in the last year, a man has been arrested. The only thing that's been released linking him is that they released now that they found a bullet at the scene. It was unspent, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And it came from or recycled through a gun that he owns.
Yes.
So what did that crime, without being able to talk about more than is known to the public, and I know they actually released more. There's been some defense documents that have gotten a little more detailed, but was that planned? Was that power? Was that fantasy? Was that?
No, that's a planned. When you look at the whole case, it's a planned attack, and I think it was just whoever happened upon him at that moment was going to become the victim. I think that's really what happened there. And it's interesting because I first got introduced to that case right after it happened. We were teaching in Utah, and there was actually two coroners who had come to the training from Indiana, and they were like, will you please go work on this case? And I said, that's not how this works. They have to call me. I'm not going to call them. And we talked about the case, and I said from the very beginning, that person lives there. They live in that community just because of the remote location of where this had happened. And, when you go there and I walk the bridge and I walk the crime scene, I would have just stopped on the other side of the bridge not knowing there was houses 50 yards away. So whoever did this had that intent of taking them even further away because they knew those houses were there. So that's what and that was another one of those cases where everyone wanted it to be the wandering psychopath. Everyone wanted it to be some guy who was driving down the interstate, stopped on the side of the interstate, and just happened upon these girls. And it ends up not being that. And that was, I think, one of the big things about that case is that, super planned, super organized, and, it was just ended up being someone from there. And, who I think, from what everyone's saying was dismissed early on on in the investigation because he was married, because he had kids of his own. Oh, it can't be that guy. And it ends up being that guy.
Because he came forward like right away, right? And was like, I was on the bridge that day, just
Yes.
FYI.
Yeah. It's like, and they said, and in the news they said that, like he comes in like day 2 or 3 and he's interviewed and they talk to him and he says, hey, I was there, I saw them, da, 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 da. And, and they're like, oh, not you. Let's move on to someone, And that's the shame of it. That's the shame of it. When you look at these things and when you look at that crime, and I won't get into the details, but I know the why. I know the overall over what this was all about here. And if you understood that piece of it, you'd be able to pause. And I always tell people, when you're investigating a case, if something causes you to pause, it's a problem. So same thing there. That would have caused me a pause with this guy and said, well, let's look at him a little bit better, a little bit more in depth. So.
Let's circle back. I had mentioned BTK's in the news. We don't need to talk about his crimes necessarily, but when you think about him as a perpetrator, having known his crimes, knowing who he is and that he's caught, they're suspecting now they've come across some old journal entries and logs and stuff that had been kept in evidence for a long time that actually might point to a lot of other victims who are actually just missing people. And the police in, I believe, Oklahoma are trying to talk to him. I know his daughter has even gone trying to get him to talk. What would be the way that someone like that would talk? Obviously, if this is true, he's gone a long time without saying a word.
It's, again, being able to understand him, being able to understand why he committed his crimes and being all right with that. You're not going to get the normal cop to go in a room with him. And you got to get him to want to brag about it. And the interesting part about it is him and any other sadist, those crimes are so fantasy-driven that every time they talk about it, they're reliving the crime. And that's where you got to get him to the point where he wants to talk about it. But sometimes the problem is their very first victims, their very early on victims are the ones that are most special to them and most important to them. It's almost like they're unicorns that they're not going to talk about them.
Oh, really?
Yes. I'm going to hold them close to my heart and not want to talk about them. I mean, it's interesting with that.
Why?
Because it's their first ones. So that's my first kill. You know what I mean? And it feels that special to them. So they're not going to want to talk about. I'll talk about these other 20, but I'm not going to talk about the first 2. So, and that's the interesting part about that. You got to really get in there and get them to see that you understand what they did, why they did it. And again, that's the big piece is the why. I understand why you did this, and I'm all right with you doing X, Y, and Z to that person. So let's kind of have this conversation about it.
Interesting.
So, and it is. I mean, and when you see a lot of them, they won't. When you had Leonard Lake and Charles Ng in California, there were some of those early on victims that no one knew about. And it was the same type of thing because they kind of held them special, and because they used to take driver's licenses and their driver's licenses were in a different place than the other 20 because they were that special to them as far as their victims.
I feel like I've heard before that maybe they're like, oh, they're just not proud of it. It didn't go as planned. But you're saying that might not be the case.
That might not be the case because criminal behavior mimics normal behavior, okay?
Yeah.
We've all had fantasies before. We've all had fantasies about other people, okay? And we all have sexual fantasies about other people. That doesn't always live up to our fantasy, right or wrong. I mean, it just happens. And I always use the whole thing of the very first time you have any type of sexual relation with somebody, that first time never lives up to what you expect it to be.
Yeah.
But you rework it in your mind and you're like, yeah, that was all right. Same thing with them. If it doesn't go the way they want to, they'll just rework it in their mind afterwards and make it look, or in their own mind, it's going to be a successful thing. So, and that's how they work. And especially even with these sadists, they're the same way. They'll just rework it. But like I said before, they're learning and going down this path of, voyeurism and picarism and fetishes and all of these other things. So they're jumping from one to the next to the next.
What is picarism?
Picarism is the slicing or piercing of the skin for sexual gratification. That's what picarism is. So if anybody ever runs up to you on the street and sticks you with a pin, that's a problem.
Keep track of that.
Keep track of that.
Deal.
So,
Deal.
Make sure you call somebody about that. But they're called piqûres. That's what they're called.
I've heard voyeurism a zillion times. I've never heard of piquerism.
Piquerism, yeah.
I feel like we should know what that is. I feel like
we should know what that is. You know what I'm saying? We should know what that is. And we've seen a lot of, and over my career. And again, that's why it's important. I don't expect everyone to have the level of knowledge I do.
Yeah.
But I want everyone to have that understanding that all you need to do is pick up the phone and call me.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And we can have that conversation because that's that. If you deal with an individual like that, you have to understand that he's getting sexual gratification from doing this. Like we had a guy one time, like he would slice females' jeans, walk up behind them, and slice their jeans and cut them here or cut them there while they're doing it. And again, he was a piqueur. He was into piquerism, and that he got sexual gratification from doing that.
Does that always escalate if it's not stopped?
Yes. And think about it. And again, this behavior mimics normal behavior. We do not have sex or have whatever now like we did when we first started. Things change. What we like changes. You hit the ceiling. And especially with these guys, you'll hit the ceiling. Well, this doesn't satisfy me as much as it did before. I'm going to take the next step. And that's why we have, and like we always say, that's why cannibalism and necrophilia are those top two, because a lot of people hit that I'm a sexual sadist but can't go into the necrophilia, can't go into the cannibalism. So they hit the ceiling right there. And won't take the next step.
I got a couple old cases for you. So another one you're familiar with, Burger Chef.
Okay.
So for those who don't know, it's the 70s. Four they're teenagers, young adults, they're working at a Burger Chef, like fast food restaurant, closing up one night. They go missing. Someone comes to the store, they're just gone. And they're found the next day or two in another county, still in Indiana, and they've been murdered, all four of them. Two of them shot, one of them stabbed, one of them, I believe, beaten to death. What does that tell you?
Well, I had the opportunity, just like you. You did a podcast, I think, on that.
I did.
And I had the opportunity to review the case. Not as in-depth as I'm going to, but I met with them and looked at the case. But the interesting thing about that case, when everyone saw that case at first, they're like, oh, this had to be a robbery gone bad. And the focus was on the restaurant and them being taken from there. But when you look at the case, the most important piece of that is where the bodies are dumped. Because, where they're at doesn't mean anything as far as, like, they're taken 20 miles away, or I think it was 25 miles away, and then dumped in some remote location. And when I saw it, I'm like, well, that's the most important piece to this versus where they were abducted from, and then the level of injuries to the four victims. Like, you have to look at those four victims and you have to say, okay, which one of these victims caused this to happen? Okay. And there has to be a focus to one of those victims, and whoever is, stabbed more or beaten more or shot more, that's probably the focus of what this was all about. And you have to look at that.
Can you tell what subtype this fits, or are we in a scenario where there's potentially more than one person and then there's different subtypes? Or
well, first off, there has to be more than one person because they moved the manager's car. So someone has to be controlling the four people and someone has to be moving the car at the same time. So, it has to be at least two people who did this. And I even think it's more than that. I'm thinking 3 to 4 people. But when you look at the subtypes, there's always a leader of the pack. So when you have multiple offenders, there's always that one person who's in control. So this is a power assertive offender, and probably all of them are. Because you see this, there's no deviance, there's no sexual deviance, there's nothing like that. It's very specific as far as we're going to take you and we're going to do X, Y, and Z to you for this reason. So
I'm working on a case right now where, this is one you have never looked at, so limited information. Woman is at her home in a very nice neighborhood, middle of the day. She has someone over at her house. Like, that person leaves 2:30. By 3:20, when her son gets off the bus, she's gone. A neighbor says that they saw her doing some yard work. There's like people out and about in this neighborhood. No one sees anything. No one hears anything. Her front door's locked. The back door is open. And they, 3 years later, find her 10 miles away in this very like densely wooded area. It makes sense that they didn't find her for 3 years. No clothes around. They think her body was there the whole time. Some skull fractures.
Okay.
What do you think? Knowing absolutely nothing I just told you in 30
No,
seconds.
yeah. No. Ready, set, go. I think it's one or two things. First off, she was taken for sexual reasons. No clothes, nothing on her. So the question being is, and the problem is her being there for 3 years. So it either is going to fall into, power assertive or power reassurance. It's all according to the reason why she was taken is which one is it. So that's more than likely what it is. She's not just taken for no reason at all. And obviously when you find her and there's no clothes there, that takes you immediately down that road of sexual assault, that someone took her and did something to her and then murdered her. And it could be, and a lot of times we see this, like my intent is to take you and I'm going to do this to you, but my intention isn't to murder you. Sometimes that'll happen because all of a sudden you're going to get scared and, oh my gosh, I don't want to get caught. And then you're going to do something to them. Or you start fighting back and all of a sudden now
it doesn't seem like she was buried or they attempted to like cover things up in any way. I don't know if they just knew this place was easy place to hide her or what.
Well, and then when you start looking at that and think about that yourself, like you have to know it's there. You have to know that remote location's there. You have to know people aren't going to... It took 3 years to find her body. So they have to have a level of familiarity with that area. Just like a lot of these other cases, like with Delphi. They had to know about that area and that area where they were in. And all of these, just like with Burger Chef we just talked about, they had to know about where they dumped those bodies because they knew... I can take them here and feel safe murdering these 4 people without being seen or being someone driving by. So the same thing here. They had to have that knowledge of where they were dumping the body.
Think you're going to do this till the day you die? I don't see you giving up anytime soon.
Well,
you keep saying you're going to move to Italy. You're never going to move to Italy.
No, I'm not going to move to Italy. No, you know what? We're at that spot, or I'm at that place right now where I'm really looking for the next generation. I'm looking for... To build that interest where, because the problem is it's like everything is IgG and DNA. It's all that flash in the pan stuff right now. And yeah, it's going to solve cases. Yeah, it's going to help identify victims, but it's not going to solve all of them. And like I always say, I'd rather solve it within 48 hours versus waiting 10 years to use IgG to solve the case. So, because in my mind, what else are they going to do over those 10 years? What other crimes are they going to commit? So, and now that's where I'm at. Like I was mentored by people. Now they are done. Like eventually this will turn in on you. And I say that all the time. I saw it with Bob Keppel. I saw it with Richard Walter. It's so intense and this high level of thinking and this high level of looking at cases and looking at all of this horror like we talked about before. And eventually, it kind of turns in on you a little bit. And I think with, some of the people, Richard especially with COVID, with not having that social interaction like you normally would for 2 years, really he took a couple steps back. But I have to stop at some point. Once I find someone to hand this off to, and I'll probably still work till the day I die, because there's always cases and people always call me. And I think in my mind, if I can help someone just move that case down, and I have no ego. You know me, I don't tell people what I do. Like none of my wife's friends know what I do. I helped publish a book a couple of years ago. No one knows I did that. I don't tell people that and I said to you last night, I don't want to come in here and talk about myself because I'm not that kind of guy. But I'm just super want to make sure we can pass this on and make sure someone's going to pick up the torch and move with it before I walk away.
How do you do that? As somebody who's listening, who's like, man, I don't want this to be a dying. I would love to do that. I know I was that person at one point, and I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to be a cop.
No, I understand. And you don't have to be a cop. You know what I mean? This is an expertise. This is, and I tell people all the time, this is me taking you and mentoring you and exposing you to as much as I possibly can. But there's a lot of work behind it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, hey, I'm going to go down all these crazy rabbit holes. I'm going to go, and even you, like when you first got into podcasting, you didn't think you were going to see all of this crazy stuff that you've seen. And, and like you can't unsee it. You can't unhear it. And same thing here. Like you just need to find that right person who has that drive to say, I want to do that. I want to be that guy, or I want to be the next generation.
But they need some kind of credentials, right? Like, otherwise no one takes them seriously.
No, they do. Like Richard Walters, he's got a master's degree in psychology. You know what I mean? Never a cop, never worked a crime scene before. He does everything from afar.
So really, like if someone needs to have some kind of like psychology or something, but they need to find someone to mentor them.
They do. And they need to be able to be exposed to this stuff. Like I always joke, about starting Crime Junkies University, to expose people to this, to say, hey, I want to learn. Like right now, as we're teaching, we're starting to allow college students in the rooms, just like we let you come in the room, under Richard screaming and yelling. You were there, and I don't want her here. But again, it's, because I'm trying to get them to be interested in this field and really, as you're a junior in college, say, okay, I want to do that. So now you can adjust your career path to where you want to be, so.
I could probably get thousands of kids in a room.
I know you can.
No doubt. If I was like, hey, come to this weekend-long seminar.
And we're going to talk about this.
They would it would sell out. They couldn't sign up fast enough.
Yes.
I couldn't sign up fast enough.
And we've done it. Like when I was with the state police, we used to go teach college kids. We used to teach the public. We have a watered down version. You're not going to see the horror things, but you're going to see it and you're going to understand it. Because I look at it this way. I want people to know and understand. I want people to, because the public is where we get our juries from. The public is the ones who are going to say, hey, this is what I think about this case and give their opinion. And I'd rather have them give their opinion from a level of I've been educated to this point where I can understand what I'm looking at versus not.
Yeah, I didn't even think about it from a jury's perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. You just never know. You never know.
All right. Well, Crime Junkie University coming at you.
In
2027. Well, Zip, thank you again for coming. This will not be the last time people hear your voice. I so appreciate it. Anywhere people can find you. We have a lot of law enforcement that listens. If somebody wants to pick up the phone and give you a call, how do they find you?
It's simple. I have my own website. It's patrickjzirpoli.com. Has my background on there, everything I've done. Plus, the Sherry Black Foundation website is out there, and it's sherryblack.org or sherryblackfoundation.org. And it has my bio, all my contact information is on there. And my cell phone's right on my website. Like I tell people, call me. Like I don't
That's insane. You should take that off.
No, I don't care. Because I guess if I don't know you, I'm going to hang up on you. So. But I tell people, you got to reach out and say, hey, even law enforcement or whoever. And we do a ton of training. And, that's just a phone call. You call and say, hey, I'm a police officer here, and we could probably get 40 people in a room. Can you come and do 3 days of training for us?
And that's what the foundation does. They'll just show up and put it on.
Yes, that's what we do. We come and put it on. You know what I'm saying? And, it costs a couple dollars for the agency. But at the end of the day, like I always tell somebody, think about if you can solve a crime faster and be able to get it done in 48 hours instead of letting it sit for 5 years, you paying for this training, really, you're making it up tenfold, because you're not going to pay now someone to work on something for 10 years or have to spend all this money for lab testing and spend all this money for these other things when we could teach them that, hey, this is when this caused you a pause.
Yeah.
That's going to be where you have to look for your answer to the crime. So.
All right. You heard it here first. Text him. All right, you guys, don't forget to follow this show, add it to your library, and don't forget to follow Crime Junkie. We're going to have brand new episodes every last Friday of the month. But if you can't wait until then, you can hear Crime Junkie Radio on the SiriusXM app for your 24/7 true crime fix. And you can follow me at Ashley Flowers on Instagram and Ashley Flowers Crime Junkie on TikTok. I will see you guys next month. Crime Junkie AF.